Hello and welcome to Edexcel 1 to 9 GCSE revision. We're going to be looking at paper 2, the Cold War Crises from 1958 up to 1970. We're going to be using 6 acronyms to help us remember the events of 1958 up to 1970. Those are Muggy and Wall for the Berlin Wall, Havana and Costly for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Spring and Curbed for the Prague Spring. You should set your sheet out into 6 boxes as pictured on the screen, writing the acronyms down the left hand side of each page, or you can use the acronyms to make flashcards or practice them alongside some exam questions. Let's start with the events leading up to the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and to remember these events we use the word muggy. Muggy. To act in a disingenuous or deceptive way. For example, going behind another Love Islander's back and making romantic suggestions towards another villa resident.
Oh my god, that is well muggy.
Between 1949 and 1961, about 4 million East Germans fled to the west through Berlin as they were unhappy about economic conditions, such as the lack of consumer goods and access to democracy. By 1961, the refugee problem increased to more than 20,000 people a month, many of them professional and skilled craftsmen. This brain drain weakened the East German economy and upset the Soviet Union. In 1958, Khrushchev demanded that the Allies leave Berlin within 6 months and that the city should become neutral and free of any US influence. The Soviets believed that America were using Berlin to spy on East Germany and the Soviet Union, which is probably true. In order to diffuse this tension, Eisenhower and Khrushchev had successful meetings at Geneva and Camp David. Despite these conferences being very positive, nothing was actually agreed, particularly Eisenhower's open skies policy, whereby both sides were allowed to essentially spy on each other so that nobody had anything to hide. Khrushchev was against this. However, the Americans were spying on East Germany and East Russia anyway. 9 days before the start of the summit, the USSR shot down an American spy plane and captured its pilot, Gary Powers. Khrushchev demanded that all spy flights be stopped and that America apologise. Eisenhower refused to apologise and the Paris summit was abandoned. The 1960 US elections was dominated by the Cold War. Therefore, JFK's promise to resist communism was well received by the American public. At the Vienna summit, Khrushchev believed that he could intimidate the new young president in the same way that he did Eisenhower. However, JFK refused to be bullied, invested $3.5 billion in defences, which provoked Russia to do the same in Berlin. Our second acronym is WALL, which help us remember the consequences of the Berlin Wall being made in 1961. Remember that 2/3 of your Cold War paper are all about consequences. So that's question 1 and your 2 important questions for question 3. On the 13th of August 1961, Khrushchev closed the border between East and West Berlin and began building the Berlin Wall. Its official purpose was to keep Western fascists from entering East Germany and undermining communism. President Kennedy admitted that even though this wall was not ideal, he would rather have a wall than a war. The Berlin Wall was supposed to lead to less tension. However, in order to prevent people crossing the border, armed watchtowers were installed. Over time, East German officials replaced the barbed wire wall with one that was sturdier and more difficult to scale. A 12-foot tall, 4-foot wide wall was accompanied by a death strip of spotlights, vicious dogs, machine gun traps, and armed soldiers. This would lead to more tension in the coming years. Luckily, 5,000 people, including 600 guards, managed to cross the border by climbing over the barbed wire, crawling through the sewers, and driving through unguarded parts of the wall at high speeds. Unfortunately, 170 people were not as lucky, including Peter Fechter, as pictured in the image, who was shot trying to escape over the wall, and his picture was spread all across the world's media. The wall stood as a long-lasting symbol of division between the US and the Soviet Union. It was often a source of tension on both sides, as demonstrated by the events in October 1961. An argument between a guard and an American soldier led to tanks facing off against each other for over 16 hours. This would set the tone for the next 30 years of the relationship between America and Russia until the wall finally came down in 1991. Our third acronym is Havana. This is going to help us remember the events that lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Remember, for narrative accounts, you need to be using lots of connectives. Therefore, as a result, this led to. Listen out for them in the following couple of slides. Under the military dictatorship of Batista, Cuba was an ally of America, which was very important considering that Cuba is just 90 miles south of the American mainland. In 1959, Castro overthrew Batista's corrupt government and promised to deliver equality and communism to the people. Castro soon delivered on these promises by seizing land and US businesses before nationalising them for the benefit of the Cuban people. America responded by banning the import of Cuban sugar, which was their biggest source of income. As a result, Castro turned to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, who was more than willing to provide money and weapons in return for an ally so close to US soil. JFK and the CIA planned to train Cuban exiles who had fled the country to America to invade Cuba and replace Castro with a capitalist pro-US government. In 1961, La Brigada invaded Cuba as planned. However, Castro's 20,000 troops squashed these invaders within 2 days. This battle was nicknamed the Bay of Pigs after the decisive nature of this victory over a large US-backed force. After the invasion, Castro felt vulnerable. Therefore, Khrushchev continued to supply Cuba with weapons and supplies. In response to America installing Jupiter ballistic missiles in Turkey, which was a NATO country at the time, Russia began shipping its own nuclear materials to Cuba, as seen in this picture. On the 14th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane photographed Russian missile sites on Cuba. The US expected these missiles to be ready by November. Therefore, over the next 13 days, a naval blockade surrounded Cuba, preventing any Russian supplies from entering the country. The world watched in terror, as any act of aggression from either side would have resulted in mutually assured destruction. The Soviets, however, were the first to back down, and after 13 days of tension, Soviet ships began retreating. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if JFK was prepared to do the same in Turkey. Both sides came inches away from pressing the button, which would ultimately have ended in all-out nuclear war. As I said before, 2/3 of your Cold War paper are about consequences, so remember to use words like tension, development of Cold War, and these will help you gain more marks. The superpowers had nearly gone to war and communication had been poor during this crisis, leaving the world on edge. In order to ensure better communication in the future, a hotline was set up, which was a direct telephone from the White House to the Kremlin in Russia.
You used to call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need my love. Call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need my love.
I know when the hotline bling,
That can only mean one thing.
Moving on, there were open talks to begin the process of nuclear non-proliferation. In order to reduce the likelihood of mutually assured destruction, the USA and Russia would later agree not to share technologies with countries to try and limit the spread of nuclear weapons. This would later be the main focus of conversations at the SALT I and SALT II agreements. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 had the sole function of preventing weapons being placed in the Earth's atmosphere. The USA and the USSR had been competing in the space race for the last 15 or 16 years. Therefore, it was important that neither side would use its new space-age technology for non-peaceful purposes. The first treaty that was signed was the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963. This prevented the testing of nuclear weapons on land, in the Earth's atmosphere and underwater. Even though this treaty was small, it was a significant step towards the control of nuclear weapons and the improvement of relations between America and the Soviet Union. All of these consequences decreased the likelihood of nuclear war in the future, in particularly the removal of nuclear installations from Turkey and Cuba. However, Khrushchev was unable to get JFK to admit the removal of Turkey nukes publicly. Therefore, it appeared that he had lost the war of words. In 1964, Khrushchev was forced to resign and was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev as a result. The USA appeared victorious during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite their early failures at the Bay of Pigs and many unsuccessful attempts to assassinate Castro, the whole world watched as Russian ships retreated first, removed their weapons from Cuba, and people saw Kennedy as a great statesman who stood up to communism in line with his presidential campaign promises. Acronym number 5 is SPRING. The Prague Spring is very, very similar to the Hungarian uprising, so make sure that you try and separate these as much as possible, as it's really easy to get confused. Stalin's death in 1953 encouraged reformers to criticise the Soviet Union's harsh government over the satellite states. Many called for the relaxation of its control and openly blamed Stalin for many problems in Eastern Europe. This relaxation of control would later become known as de-Stalinisation. Prague and the rest of Czechoslovakia was ruled by the hardline communist Antonin Novotny. He ran Czechoslovakia like a dictatorship, often used the secret police to get rid of opposition, and was slow to bringing in any reforms. As you can see, these reforms were desperately needed. The Soviet Union forced the Czechoslovakians to send over all raw materials they produced, such as steel, despite them needing it themselves. Czechoslovakia's economy, as a result, was in serious decline, and by the 1960s, this had led to a fall in living standards. Novotny was impeached and accused of poor leadership, therefore being replaced by Dubček. He was a devoted communist, but wanted to win more Czechoslovakian support by removing the worst features of the strict communist regime. He called this new brand of communism socialism with a human face. In January 1968, Dubček's government announced a plan for a new model of reforms. It would reduce the government's control over industries and allow freedom of speech. This revolution was called the Prague Spring, which made Brezhnev very nervous. There were growing fears in the Kremlin. Dubček had a close relationship with Tito of Yugoslavia, who openly criticised Stalin and the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was worried about his control over Czechoslovakia. Therefore, on the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded Prague. And our final acronym is CURBED. CURBED is another word for prevented or stopped, which is exactly what happened to the reforms that were tried to be put in place by Alexander Dubček and the Czechoslovakian Democrats. Czechoslovakia and other Warsaw Pact countries were sent a message that communist rule would not be undermined. The Brezhnev Doctrine stated that the Soviet Union had the right to invade any country that threatened the security of the Eastern Bloc. As a result, the Czechoslovakian uprising, otherwise known as the Prague Spring, was curbed or prevented. The Czechoslovakians did not fight the Soviet troops but protested peacefully. Some people greeted the tanks with flowers but were ran down. Jan Palach, pictured right, was so upset that he set himself on fire as a form of protest. As a result, Western communist parties, in particular in France and Italy, began to distance themselves from the Soviet Union. The invasion also damaged Russia's relationship with its own allies. China did not like the Soviet actions in Czechoslovakia and condemned them as being too forceful. Meanwhile, Romania and Yugoslavia had refused to help the Soviets invade, also began taking more independent actions against the USSR. However, the invasion reminded people that Russia would respond with force if its authority was threatened. The USA and Britain protested against Soviet action, although America offered no military support, as they were becoming increasingly involved in Vietnam. Similarly to the Hungarian uprising of 1956, the Czechs were forced to approve the invasion and in some cases apologise to the Soviet Union for causing disruption to the Warsaw Pact. 300,000 Czechoslovakians fled, whilst others in the country tried to protest with little success. Dubček was forced to resign as leader of Czechoslovakia and was replaced by strict communist leader Gustav Husak. Czechoslovakia reverted back to a strict communist regime with none of the Prague Spring reforms in place. And there we go. We have 6 acronyms to help us remember the Cold War Topic 2 main events of Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis and Prague Spring. Thank you very much for watching. Keep practicing the acronyms and good luck in June.